Hi there, welcome back to the channel. It's James here. I hope you're doing okay. Today we're going to do a little bit of a philodendron care video, and I've been pushing this off for a little while because I kind of wanted to make sure that I had as much experience in as many growing seasons as possible, and I've only been growing philodendron for about 1.5 years at this point, so the more time the better, obviously. I wanted to kind of play around with some of the things that I'm going to suggest and just sort of see how they go before I share them with people. But that said, I do feel like I have a relatively good grasp of what my philodendron personally enjoy, the ways that I get them to produce slightly larger leaves, that I speed up the growth, etc. So that's all I'm going to share. Obviously, I'm going to miss things. I know that I'm going to miss things. I was sitting here this morning trying to remember, trying to work out if there's anything really obvious that I'm leaving out, and it's more than likely that there is. So if you notice a big gap in this, please let me know down in the comments below, and I will certainly be making an updated care video at some point. So yeah, we're just going to get straight into it. I have a relatively large philodendron collection, but this is kind of just a very generalized thing, so I'm not specifically talking about any particular plant. This will apply broadly to all philodendron that you're likely to come across, but obviously you will have to tweak it depending on the plant. It's going to be trial and error. This is going to be probably quite a long video, so you can kind of just jump to wherever you most want to go. But like I said before, this is just a very broad look. I could probably do an individual video on each one of these different parts, and I might potentially do that at some point, but this is just like, if you are starting off with a philodendron or you have a couple in your collection that you want to kind of maximize the potential of, this is a good way to do that. So we're going to get straight into it. The first one I wanted to talk about is light, which is like one of the most crucial things for plants. Obviously, they need that to produce the energy that they need to grow. I think there's this slight myth going around in the plant community that philodendron are low light plants, and in my experience that is actually not very true. In the plants that I have in my collection are all medium to high light plants. Obviously, you can grow a philodendron in lower light, but you're much more likely to keep a small leaf pattern and to get a very, very leggy kind of growth. There's a Brazil up there. I don't know if you can see it, might be a little bit gloomy, but there's a Brazil round top of the upended sofa there that I have had in lower light, and it is just the leaves have stayed very small and it's very, very long and leggy. So you will get that result. And with climbing philodendron like this, I found that I had a melanochrysum, a little one that I was growing in low light, and it's the same. They just get very, very tall and leggy. So you really do want to supply them with enough light. So I'd say in my home, the best windows for that kind of light are either southern. Most of my sort of larger plants are in a south facing window, or east and west. In the northern facing windows, you will get some growth, particularly if it's right in a windowsill, but I feel like direct sunlight is really, really helpful for philodendron. And there's this kind of fear about exposing your plants to direct light because they'll burn, which is a possibility. So you really do want to make sure that you are making sure that the plants are used to that bright light before you just chuck them in a really, really bright light position, if that makes sense. I have a grow tent, which I've spoken about before, and that is absolutely incredible. I will do, like I said, I'm going to do a sort of more in-depth review in a little bit, so we'll talk about light intensity, all that kind of stuff then, but essentially the longer you can expose a plant to light, and the higher that intensity, the more available energy there is for that plant. So you kind of want to maximize all of that if you want to maximize your plant's growth. If you're happy with a slightly smaller plant with slightly smaller leaves and a slightly slower growth rate, then it's completely fine to have it in a low light position. So if you're a little bit if your space is a little bit limited, that's completely fine. But if you are looking to get bigger plants, bigger leaves, more mature forms, you really do need to up the light. Moving on to water. So in my experience with philodendron, they really do like to dry out. The other aroids like Anthurium and Alocasia and stuff like that, they kind of like to, in my experience, stay a little bit moist. But for my philodendron, I really just kind of ignore them until they visibly show signs that they need water. So until there's a little bit of like leaf drooping, or the growth rate starts to drop, or the soil is really, really visibly dry. But even that isn't a very reliable method, because some of my plants I have in very big pots, like this Glorious is in quite a big pot, and even with a humidity meter, it doesn't get really, really deep down in the pot. So I really just kind of check in with the plants, observe the leaves, that kind of thing. It's very visible. If you've had a plant for a long time, you will have noticed over time how it behaves when it is dehydrated, and that's the kind of thing that I personally respond to over any kind of schedule or anything like that. I guess I'm in a privileged position, particularly over this quarantine period. It's been very, very easy to do that, but I do know that when things go fully back to normal, it is going to be harder to do that, and a routine is definitely helpful for watering. Yeah, another good thing I'd say to do with philodendron in particular is to kind of flush through when you're watering. So generally for myself, I tend to kind of just water enough to moisten when I water regularly, and then once every 1 or 2 months I'll do a proper flush through. So I take the plants outside or into the bathroom or whatever, and I pour water through just to really flush everything out of the soil, because otherwise you get buildup of fertilizers and you can cause root burn, you can limit the growth in that way. So we really just want to make sure that that you're kind of cleaning out the soil every now and again. Obviously we're not going to swap out the potting medium, that's not necessary, but you can just flush through and kind of get rid of any excess salts. Okay, talking about warmth, this is a little bit debatable because it really depends on the philodendron you have. If you have a lowland philodendron or a highland philodendron, they're going to want slightly different conditions, but generally I would say that my growing space sort of runs throughout the year between probably about 17, 18 when it's really, really cool outside, and up to about 30 in summer. And philodendron seem to survive in all of that. Obviously their growth rate really, really picks up when you hit sort of 25 to 30. So if you can replicate that in your space, that's fantastic. But generally people can't unless you have like a dedicated plant room or a greenhouse or something like that with heating. So yeah, just make sure, I feel like the general rule is you don't want to really drop below 10 to 15 degrees. That's kind of where you don't want to drop below. I have philodendron outside at the moment in my outside greenhouse, and I think last night and the night before, because we're in an English summer here, it hit about 11 degrees, and they're going to be fine with that. They're going to be fine. They're slightly hardier ones, but maybe don't put ones that are really important to your collection out in cooler temperatures. Just be a little bit cautious about that. Good ways to generate heat if you don't have a dedicated room is to get maybe a greenhouse, particularly if you have a space with direct sunlight. I have a grow tent, a transparent grow tent, which is essentially just a plastic outdoor greenhouse that I have inside, but directly in a south-facing window. So when the sun does come in, it really, really heats up in there. And it keeps it warmer at night as well. So for plants that are less comfortable out in my general living space, I have them in there. The humidity is higher, the heat gets a little bit higher, and they don't dry out as quickly, of course. Fertilizer, I fertilize basically every time I water, very, very diluted. I use 2 main fertilizers at the moment, which I'll do a video on about at another time because I think it's helpful. But yeah, I try and use very, very broad spectrum fertilizers, so the plants are getting sort of everything that they need. There are some really great ones on the market, so I'll definitely be doing a video on that at some point, but I think it is helpful. In the winter, obviously I will fertilize less, so I'll generally do once a month, maybe less than that even, because the growth rate really, really drops on some of my plants. If a plant is really growing fast still, then I'll keep fertilizing it. But during the growing season, then I definitely will water every time. I will definitely fertilize every time I water. So that could be once a week, that could be more than that. In this really hot period that just passed, I was watering probably 3 to 4 times a week because things are drying out super, super fast. Now we're going to talk about like a relatively interesting, I think there's a little bit of a point of contention for philo people out here. We're going to talk about support for a second. So the sort of idea is that in order to get mature leaves on a plant, you want to provide that plant with a support that not only supports the weight of the plant as it gets bigger, but also provides it with some kind of medium, whether it's sphagnum or coconut fiber for the roots to attach to. And in my experience, it's not so important that the roots are attached. It's more important that the plant has a really, really stable support. So for this guy, for example, it is attached to the pole. So this is made out of moss, and the aerial roots have really, really settled in there and taken hold. And that has obviously, in my experience, it kind of speeds up the leaf growth, so they get bigger faster, but they wouldn't not get big without that, if that makes sense. I have another example here of one that is not attached. So this is a Philodendron majestic, and obviously different philodendron have different growth patterns and different rates of sort of reaching maturity. So the only really good way to compare would be to take a cutting from the same plant and grow it in different ways. But this, for example, this is a Philodendron majestic. It is not attached to anything. It has quite nice aerial roots because it's in my grow tent, but its leaf shape and size has massively changed within, I'd say, 3 leaves here. We've got a really, really nice increase in growth from those first couple there. So the thing that shifted for this one was humidity and light intensity. So if you think about a philodendron where they would naturally grow, generally they are epiphytes or hemiepiphytes, so they start in the soil, a lot of them, and then grow up the side of a tree up to a point where the light intensity is high enough for them to produce their fully mature leaves and to make the most out of the available light up there. But if you keep a plant in an area where the light intensity is lower, obviously they're not going to express themselves fully like that. So kind of, I think if you can combine the two of those, so if you can combine the light intensity and the support, then you're going to get the very most out of your plants. So I don't think there's one or the other that works better for everyone. I think it also depends on the philodendron. Like some plants will mature readily, some plants really, really need to settle in. I don't have like a list of the ones that prefer one or the other, so just play around with your collection. The most important thing I think is to have a really, really solid support for something, so that I don't know how they sense, it would be super interesting to look into this, but I don't know how they sense that they're supported, but so that the plant knows that it can start to produce that bigger growth without falling over or damaging itself. If you are going to use a moss pole and you want the roots to attach, it's important to keep the moss pole wet. They're not going to attach unless you have a really, really high humidity environment. They're in a grow tent or a greenhouse or somewhere where the humidity is really high. You need to make sure that it stays wet. So there are some really nice like self-watering poles available on the market at the moment, so that's a good idea. Otherwise, you just have to make sure that you keep regularly watering the plant. Otherwise, those aerial roots that have sunken into the moss will just dry out and die, and it kind of, it's no longer really doing so much. Also with a moss pole, it's kind of nice because if you do, so long as your moss pole isn't too dense, which mine kind of are, but if you do come to a point where you want to propagate your plant, then that plant already has, you have to sort of pull them out and stuff, but your plant already has established aerial roots that you can, so that you can just pot it straight on and have a happy growing plant immediately. Okay, humidity is another interesting one for me. I think I've had obviously I've experienced increased aerial root growth and leaf size in high humidity, but I don't think it is 100% necessary. I think your watering regimen is more important than having super, super high humidity. So for most people and most philodendron, I don't think it's necessary to have humidity over 60%. My philodendron that I grow outside of my grow tent are in about 50 to 60%, and they get really big. So this one is in 50 to 60%, even less sometimes, because I don't have a humidifier running at the moment. So it's probably 30 to 60 where it fluctuates. Both of these philodendron, that Bilietier and the Pastazanum silver there, also grow in that humidity range. So you will get good growth even without super, super high humidity. You also want to be, I need to be aware of my space. I don't want to get mold growing everywhere, so you do want to be conscious of that. That said, it really does help aerial root production, so if you are looking for something to attach, then a good way to get the roots to attach faster is to boost the humidity. In my experience, the consistency of your humidity is more important than how high it is. So I just spoke about the massive fluctuation in my humidity, so it's not super important, but I have had better results in environments where I've managed to keep that humidity stable wherever it is, whether it's stable at 60% or stable at 80%. The plant seems to be able to adapt to that a little bit better. The main issue re-humidity that I have encountered with philodendron is when the leaves are emerging. So this is the point when they get stuck, they can tear, stuff like that. So if you are in a lower humidity environment, I would say just be aware of your plant, and when the leaf does start coming through, I would preemptively spray that emerging leaf with water, just to make sure it's nice and lubricated to come out, because sometimes they get stuck before you, and you can't really tell they're stuck, and they start to buckle, and then by the time you realize and give them a little helping hand, it's too late and the leaf has snapped. So if you do think that your humidity is a little bit on the lower end, maybe just be aware of that and give them a little spray. But when it does get drier, so during the winter months, already at this point I can feel that it's getting a little bit drier in my growing space. I do have 2 humidifiers that I have used in the past and will certainly use over the winter. On very low, I'll keep it probably around 50%. I don't want anything super high to live in. But I have a Lavoie humidifier and I have an Elec Holmes humidifier, which I've done a brief review about before, but I'll probably do another one as we get into winter and we start looking into sort of grow lights and all that kind of stuff a little bit more. So yeah, There are plenty of options out there. Have a little look. You don't have to get something super expensive. I'd say the price range of the ones I have is sort of around £70, and they are obviously guaranteed to last for a certain amount of time, and you get pretty good results. So I don't think it's necessary for most people, but I think if you do want to maximize the leaf size and the growth rate and stuff like that, it's helpful to sort of lift yourself out of that 30–40% range. You want to be a little bit higher than that. Talking about root space, so sort of how tightly you want to pot your plants. Philodendron generally want to be root bound. I have planted philodendron in pots that are too large for them, and I have visibly seen the growth rate slow down. I don't know why that is in particular, whether the attention just moves straight down to the roots and they try and spread as wide as possible before they go back to the leaf growth, the above ground growth, but I have definitely noticed it. So if you do want to produce more growth faster, and in my experience bigger leaves, a slightly tight pot is helpful. So I don't mean like minuscule, because you will get the opposite reaction there. If the pot is really small, then the leaves will stop growing as well. So that's actually a really good way to check if your plant is underpotted, is too small, is if the growth rate slows down or stops. If everything else is fine, if you're watering fine, if it's got enough light, if it's got enough fertilizer, and the growth rate is really slowing down, the pot may be too small. So you kind of want to, it's sort of dancing in that middle lane. You want to have enough space for the roots to kind of continue to develop so the plant doesn't suffocate, but also not too much that it feels like it's drowning. Again, it would be really interesting to look into why the plants react like that. But that is just my experience. Some people I'm sure have had the opposite experience. Another really sort of obvious maybe reason not to overpot is just to make sure that you're not over watering, because if you have a large pot, particularly if it's a glazed or a plastic large pot, it's really easy to have too much water in there, because you feel like it's dry on the top, but when you get to the bottom it's like really stodgy and wet, and you could rot your roots out. So it's also a little bit easier just to manage the watering regimen of your plants if they're in smaller pots. Another important one that I have kind of noticed throughout my philodendron growing journey is airflow. I didn't really give it too much thought when I first started growing philodendron, and I had okay results, but I really started to get bigger leaves and more healthy growth when I incorporated some conscious airflow. So obviously open windows, open doors, stuff like that, that's helpful, but then you're kind of sacrificing on warmth and humidity, because yeah, you're going to lose some humidity if you've got your space completely open like that. So if you do want to keep everything a little bit more sort of isolated, particularly as it gets cooler, and you want to keep it warm and humid, then I would recommend getting fans or some way of keeping the air circulating. I currently have 2 fans. I have one in my grow tent and I have one out in my general growing space, and they're very small, nothing too super crazy. I have them low and they're just on basically all of the time. Sometimes I switch them off at night, but they just kind of keep everything moving. They make sure that I've found that it actually helps with the trapped leaf syndrome that we were talking about before, where the leaves kind of get stuck as they're emerging. I found that it really does help with that. And it also stops so much mold growth. When I first got my grow tent, which I showed in a few videos ago now, I didn't have a fan in there, and very quickly mold started growing on the soil, on the moss poles, even on some of the leaves. But as soon as I got the fan in there, that kind of stopped. So very interesting, but I think it's just like an easy way to make sure that you're just covering that ground. You don't want to lose leaves to mold or fungus or anything like that. So I think it's a helpful thing to do. So we're going to talk about potting medium for a second. So the potting medium that obviously this varies, because I don't have like a recipe. It kind of depends on when I'm making the potting medium, and for what plants I'm making it. So, and for what pot I'm making it. So this we'll get into this in a little bit, but generally I go for something that is really open and porous, just because I have a tendency to overwater when I'm watering. I don't know why, it's just something that I do, that instinct is just to water. Even I kind of have to pull myself back, which is why I got into kind of looking at how the plant is reacting rather than what the potting medium is sort of showing me, just because it's a little bit more trustworthy in my experience. So generally what I have in my potting medium, we're just going to run through a quick list. I'll have like just a basic soil base, so it could be anything. It's kind of just a potting medium. Normally I use very little of it, and then on top of that generally I add perlite for drainage. Again, I'll add orchid bark again for drainage. I'll add leca balls, so the little clay balls in there. I will add, what else do I have in that? Normally a little bit of sphagnum if I want it to retain a bit more water. That really depends, I don't always. I'll have coconut fiber, and I've used worm castings before, which I found super, super helpful for sort of like an ongoing fertilizer for the plant. I think it's really great. And then I'll have charcoal sometimes. If the plant is a little bit more special, then I add charcoal, but generally I don't. And that kind of just helps to bind some of the waste products in the soil. So if you are over fertilizing, it kind of helps avoid root burn in my experience. So yeah, you can kind of hear from that. There is a little bit of sort of gap filling stuff. So with coconut coir and just potting medium, but generally it's very, very airy, so that even if I do overwater, there's no issue because the water is just flooding straight through, and you're just keeping like an environment that holds enough humidity to keep the roots healthy, enough humidity to keep the plant growing, but not so much that you are restricting the oxygen flow to the roots. Overwatering is only really an issue if you have a really dense potting medium. If you have a plant that's potted solely in orchid bark, it's going to be extremely difficult to overwater that plant unless you have it sitting in a dish. It's going to be basically impossible because the water will just run through and the orchid bark will just hold on to whatever it can hold on to as it goes past. If you have a very, very peat heavy sort of general potting medium that you buy in a shop and you saturate that with water, then it's very likely that you will suffocate your roots. So yeah, just be aware. There's no recipe for a magic soil mix that I have. You just kind of want to make sure that it's airy and healthy and has some form of organic fertilizer, whatever you want to use, in there on top of whatever other fertilizer you're using, just so that you have kind of an onward boost, and the plant always has whatever it needs to supply its growth. Speaking of sphagnum, it's kind of a good point to mention that I do use it quite a lot. Mostly with anthurium, but also with some philodendron based around the top of the pot, because it just hangs on to a little bit of humidity, and particularly if the philodendron is a little bit smaller and I don't have it in a grow tent, it kind of promotes a little bit more root growth, aerial root growth, and below the soil because you're holding on to a little bit more moisture in there. Again, you just want to be aware that you're not oversaturating it. So if with sphagnum, the general rule of thumb, I've done a whole video on sphagnum, I'll probably redo another one because my opinions change all the time and my experience changes all the time. But generally, if you squeeze sphagnum and water actually pours out, then it's too saturated. So you really just want to have it kind of damp to the touch. Big thing at the moment is passive hydro. As a potting medium, I think using either leca or perlite or lechuza pon is something that people use a lot at the moment. I think it's great. I generally use it as something, a sort of a way to get healthy root growth quickly. I think I spoke about this in a previous video. If I have a cutting that has a small amount of root growth, then I'll put it in perlite or I'll put it in leca just to get those roots really big. I have not got experience in growing philodendron in particular for a long period of time in passive hydro, so I can't recommend it one way or the other. But I would say that in the short term it works, and it does produce large leaves, because essentially particularly if you have a good fertilizer, a good hydroponic fertilizer in the water, you're constantly providing that plant with enough humidity, enough moisture, enough nutrition to get those roots and leaves growing. So there's less of that like in-between space. That said, I have found it helpful for some of my philodendron to sort of apply a little bit of healthy stress, and I don't know how much of that is happening when they're in leca because you have this continuous source. So I have found that with particularly this philodendron, and actually the silver pastazanum up there, when I let them dry out a little bit, when I let them get like a little bit crispy or the soil gets a little bit dry and then I water them, they put out like a lot of growth all at once, which seems faster than it is if I just continuously water them. There's no science behind that. I don't know. It's just like a vague anecdotal observation. So play around with your own plants. Don't just go on what I'm saying. I would recommend, if you are going to use leca in particular for passive hydro, just give it a really nice rinse through. If you're using perlite, make sure you don't breathe in the dust, because not great for you apparently. And I have never used lechuza pon, so I don't have any recommendations or advice for that, but I've heard that it's good. I've seen good results from other people, so sure, do that, why not? The pots that I use for my philodendron, generally I try and use terracotta just because I am an overwaterer. And I also have a lot of my plants in very high humidity environments. So I have either in my window grow tent or in my closed artificial light grow tent, and if they are not in terracotta, then the medium tends to stay wet for too long because the humidity is obviously very high in there. So just so that I'm not worried when I'm away teaching or whatever, I have them in terracotta, obviously because it helps wick some of the moisture away from the roots, so it stops them rotting, but it also keeps the airflow going. So you're getting a much higher oxygen supply. Even if the soil were dry, you get more oxygen supply from a terracotta pot than you would from a plastic pot because the air can move through. Also use net pots, which are really great. Also essentially sort of best if you have a really high humidity environment. I see a lot of people trying to grow anthurium or philodendron. We're talking about philodendron, stop saying anthurium. Philodendron in net pots in like just a general home environment, and that is too dry. The medium is going to dry out too fast. So I would say if you have a plant that's in lower humidity and perhaps you're not available to water it as regularly as like every couple of days, I would recommend having it in either like a glazed or a plastic pot, just because you can, you'll still have your really chunky mix in there, so it's going to be unlikely that you'll overwater, but it will hang on to that moisture for a little bit longer. Another great thing that I like to use is transparent containers, so whether that's glass or plastic, vases, things that are not supposed to be used, and this in particular I use for propagating. So with perlite or sphagnum, I love to have them in glass containers just because you can check out what's happening with the roots and the growth below medium without having to disturb the plant and pull it out, all that kind of stuff. So I think glass is a really, really good option. And reusing stuff, so if you've got pots or jars or whatever that you would otherwise be throwing away, just keep it and grow your propagations in there because it's really, really good. We are kind of approaching the end of this video. I feel like I've covered everything that I wanted to cover. I have some vague bullet points here, but I'm kind of just improving as we go. I think the last one that it's going to be helpful to talk about is pests, because this is a common thing with philodendron. Well, with any indoor plants really, you're going to get some pests at some point. The ones that I've encountered the most with my philodendron are spider mites, thrips, and scale. I've had spider mites a lot, like a lot. I've had thrips only once so far, which is good because I do not want to have them again. I think there were thrips. I just annihilated them before any other options appeared. And I have had scale a couple of times on some philodendron. So yeah, treat them quick. As soon as you see them, particularly with spider mites, like they're very easy to treat so long as you get in there quick. If you leave them too long, then it gets harder and harder and harder. Thrips I found relatively easy. I know people really struggle with them, but I think it's because I caught them very early on. And scale was the easiest of all. I kind of just picked off whatever I could see and then sprayed the plants down, and they seemed okay. I do know that people also get things like mealybugs and aphids and stuff on the philodendron, so basically you just want to keep checking the leaves. It doesn't have to be anything super intense. You can literally just look at the front, turn it over, have a look at the back, maybe shine a light on it, and if you see any webbing or anything that looks unusual, any damage on the leaves, so yellowing around the edges generally, little speckling on the leaf, that is sometimes a sign of a pest. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a leaf that's getting old and dying. Like down here, I don't know, you can't see actually, but a couple of the leaves are kind of showing what could be pest damage, but I know that it's just because they are older leaves and they are sort of on their way out. And another thing for pests, just if you have a large collection and they're very closely packed, be even more wary because things spread very, very fast. If you have the space and the possibility to spread things out a little bit more, then that is ideal because things will take longer to get around your collection. And the last thing I wanted to say before we finish off, I think I've covered everything. I'm going to shut this off and remember something else that I wanted to talk about afterwards. It's just like, you kind of want to be patient. This isn't going to happen overnight. Like the philodendron, they do take time to grow. They're one of the faster aroids in my experience. They're much faster than the anthurium that I have. They're faster than the aglaonema that I have. But they are still sometimes frustratingly slow when you want to get a large leaf immediately, particularly if you start with a smaller plant, but you will get there. I spoke about this in my previous video, but this plant here started as a dry little stick like this tall with no leaves, no roots, nothing, and this is a year of growth. So you will get that growth if you continue to provide it with good conditions, sort of covering all of the bases that we spoke about depending on your plant and your environment. If you keep providing it with some form of healthy stress, I really think that's helpful, whether that's intense light, whether that's a slight bit of drying out. essentially you kind of don't want to coddle your plants too much. If you think about where they grow naturally, their natural growing environment, they are surrounded by constantly changing environments which impact the way they grow, the times of year that they grow, all that kind of thing. So the closest you can, obviously natural does not mean best, so we can provide better conditions in some ways for the plants that we have indoors. I think that if you do want big leaves, like you just want to try and avoid resetting the growth, so by cutting or letting the roots rot or stuff like that. So you just really want to stay on top of stuff. If you do have to cut, that's fine. I have so many plants that have just not grown well for some reason. Like they've had good conditions and they haven't grown well, but then as soon as I've cut them, they've really taken off. So sometimes that's what it takes, and don't stress about that. Just do whatever you need. And yeah, so you might lose out a little bit of actual active growing time, but you will potentially get a healthier plant back, so that's completely fine. Right, well, that was a long video, or it may be, we'll see how it is by the time I've edited it down, but thank you so much for watching. If you have questions, please ask down below. If I missed anything that's blaringly obvious, also let me know, and I will happily add it in the comments down below, or do in the next video or whatever. But yeah, thank you. I hope that was helpful. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more of these videos, please subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon. If you want to check out the progress of these plants, of these philodendron, check out my Instagram at slugplants. I post there relatively regularly, and I will see you very soon. Thank you very much.